understand me, don't you?
No, sir.
Bullseye!
For 9 straight years, Doug McClure played the cowboy every American living room trusted. Warm, funny, endlessly easygoing. Off-camera, the real story looked nothing like that. While the Virginian was turning him into a household name, he was already on his second marriage, heading toward a third, then a fourth. He buried his own father in the same year his career hit its peak, and for decades, he carried a private struggle that almost never made it into interviews or magazine profiles. This is the real gap between the man audiences thought they knew from Trampas and the one actually living behind that easy, sunlit smile. 4 weddings before the cameras ever slowed down. In late 1961, Doug McClure married actress Barbara Luna, whom he'd met while working on the television series Overland Trail. Luna later recalled being drawn in almost immediately by his confidence and his sense of humor, the same qualities that would soon make him famous. What she didn't know yet was just how fast everything was about to change. Only a few months after the wedding, Doug was called in to audition for a new Universal Western called The Virginian. Luna remembered him coming home convinced he was up against a long list of other actors, the kind of pressure studios like to apply before locking in a contract. When she asked who else was reading for the part, Doug told her there wasn't anyone else. Whether or not that was the full picture, the outcome was real. Doug landed the role of Trampas, and within months, he became one of the most recognized faces on American television. That kind of overnight success is supposed to be the good part of the story. For Doug's marriage, it wasn't. The demanding schedule and the sudden weight of fame created distance between him and Luna almost immediately. And by 1963, after roughly 2 years together, the marriage was over. Divorce filings from the time described tense arguments between the two of them. Though decades later, Luna would still speak about Doug with genuine warmth, rather than resentment, a pattern of staying on good terms with people even after everything fell apart that would follow Doug for the rest of his life. Here's the part that made this pattern so strange to the people who knew him. This wasn't Doug's first marriage, and it wouldn't be his last, not even close. Years earlier, while filming the war picture The Enemy Below in Hawaii in 1957, Doug met an opera singer named Faye Brash. The two married not long after, and their daughter, Tani, was born while Doug was still working to establish himself as an actor. That marriage ended in 1961, closing the very first chapter of his family life right before Barbara Luna entered the picture. After Luna, there would be 3 more marriages before his life was over. To understand why a man who seemed so easygoing on screen kept starting over behind closed doors, you have to go back further. To a childhood built almost entirely around horses, sports, and a version of the American West that Doug had actually lived, long before Hollywood ever asked him to perform it. The ranch hand behind the TV cowboy. Douglas Osborne McClure was born on May 11, 1935, in Glendale, California, to an accountant father and a mother who worked as a newspaper columnist. His childhood in West Los Angeles was about as stable as it gets, shaped by sunshine, the ocean, and constant outdoor activity, rather than any early brush with hardship. He captained his school's football team, played basketball, surfed regularly, and by high school had his own horse and spent most of his free time riding it. The detail that mattered most for his future career came the summer before his senior year, when Doug spent 3 months working at the Holland Livestock Company, a large cattle ranch in Nevada. While a lot of young Californians only knew the American West through movies and books, Doug was waking up before sunrise, handling livestock, and living on a schedule dictated by weather rather than a studio clock. Years later, when he stepped into Western roles, he wasn't learning a lifestyle from scratch. He was returning to one he'd already lived. Even so, Doug didn't walk straight into acting with total confidence. After high school, he took drama classes at Santa Monica City College, then enrolled at UCLA with physical education as a deliberate backup plan in case the acting career never took off. His looks landed him modeling jobs and commercials during college, which slowly opened doors into small television roles, first in Men of Annapolis, then guest spots in Death Valley Days, Maverick, and a Twilight Zone episode. None of it made him famous yet, but it built the foundation producers would eventually notice. A real turning point came in 1957 with a supporting role in the war film The Enemy Below, starring Robert Mitchum and Kurt Jürgens. It wasn't a role with much room to shine, but working alongside major stars on a big production taught him things television simply couldn't. And filming on location in Hawaii is where he met his first wife. 3 years later, in 1960, Doug landed a small part in The Unforgiven, a much bigger production directed by John Huston and led by Burt Lancaster, Audrey Hepburn, Audie Murphy, and Lillian Gish. The shoot became notorious for its difficulties, including a horseback riding accident that seriously injured Hepburn while she was pregnant. Being on set for something that dramatic, even in a small role, gave Doug a front-row seat to how high-stakes filmmaking actually worked. Television gave him his biggest pre-Virginian opportunity that same year, when he landed the lead opposite William Bendix in NBC's Overland Trail, playing a young sidekick named Frank Flippin. The show only lasted 17 episodes, but it proved Doug could anchor a series. Right after it ended, he moved almost immediately into CBS's Checkmate, playing investigator Jed Sills for roughly 70 episodes between 1960 and 1962. That role showed producers something important. Doug wasn't just a Western face. He could carry a modern, energetic character too. The role that actually changed his life didn't start out looking like a leading part at all. And the character itself wasn't even supposed to be likable in the first place. The villain that television refused to keep. In the novel The Virginian by Owen Wister, the character Trampas is a straightforward villain, a source of conflict for the story's hero. When Universal adapted the book for television in 1962, the writers made a decision that would end up defining Doug McClure's entire career. They turned Trampas into a mischievous, good-humored cowboy instead, someone audiences could actually root for. The show itself was an ambitious bet by NBC and Universal, built with 90-minute episodes at a time when most competing westerns ran only 30 or 60 minutes, giving it a scale and budget closer to a theatrical film than a typical weekly series. Doug didn't just play that shift, he helped create it. Colleagues who worked with him consistently said that a large part of Trampas's appeal came directly from Doug's own personality, his natural humor and his genuine comfort around horses bleeding into the character until it became difficult to tell where the performance ended and the real Doug began. At first, Trampas wasn't even the center of the show, which focused on the title character, played by James Drury, and Judge Henry Garth, played by Lee J. Cobb. But fan mail kept increasing, and the writers responded by expanding Trampas's role every season until he became one of the show's emotional anchors, the character who could be flawed, get into trouble, and still stay likable in a way the more serious leads couldn't. The Virginian ran an unusually long 9 seasons, from 1962 to 1971, racking up 249 episodes, an enormous number for the era and one of the longest runs any Western series ever achieved on American television. Cast members came and went constantly. Roberta Shore, who played Betsy Garth, left after season 3 to get married. Lee J. Cobb departed in 1966 and was replaced by Charles Bickford. Through all of it, only 2 actors stayed for the entire run: James Drury and Doug McClure. That constancy turned into a real friendship off-screen, one where the 2 men reportedly spoke on the phone several times a week for decades afterward, all the way until Doug's death, a bond that outlasted every one of Doug's own marriages. 9 years is a long time to be tied to one character, and when the show finally ended, Doug walked away from Shiloh Ranch carrying nationwide fame built on a role he'd shaped as much as any writer had, but also a question no contract could answer for him: the 11-year gap between being everywhere and being forgotten. When The Virginian ended in 1971, Doug McClure was only 36 years old, still young by Hollywood standards. Universal clearly believed in him, quickly lining him up for The Judge and Jake Weiler, alongside legendary actress Bette Davis. The pilot didn't generate enough interest to become a full series, and the project was released only as a standalone television movie instead. The next opportunity many expected for Doug had closed almost as fast as it opened. He tried again in 1972 with Search, a science fiction detective series where he alternated leading duties with Anthony Franciosa and Hugh O'Brien. The premise, investigators using futuristic technology to solve crimes, felt fresh for its time and drew some positive attention, but not enough to keep it running past 2 short seasons. Doug was discovering something a lot of television stars from his era ran into. Audiences loved the specific character they already knew, but they weren't necessarily ready to follow that same actor into something completely different, no matter how much range he actually had to offer. Doug later summed up how strange that stretch felt with a joke rather than a complaint, saying he sometimes got the sense that people assumed he'd simply vanished from the industry altogether. In reality, he never stopped working. He kept showing up on sets, kept learning new lines, kept doing the job the same way he always had. What had changed wasn't his effort or his ability, it was how often the public actually saw him. Since none of these post-Virginian projects came anywhere close to matching a weekly series watched by millions of households every single week for 9 straight years. Rather than chasing a repeat of Trampas-level fame, Doug quietly shifted his approach completely, and the genre he turned to next had almost nothing to do with cowboys at all. The dinosaur movies that quietly saved his career. In the mid-1970s, Doug McClure became one of the more recognizable faces in a completely different kind of movie: mid-budget fantasy adventure films based on the novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs. In 1974, he starred in The Land That Time Forgot, playing a man stranded on an island where prehistoric creatures still roamed. Critics weren't impressed, but audiences showed up anyway, both in theaters and later on television reruns, and that success opened the door to more of the same. 2 years later came At the Earth's Core, alongside horror icon Peter Cushing, taking viewers into an underground world of strange civilizations. In 1977, Doug returned to the character of Bowen Tyler for The People That Time Forgot, and by 1978, he'd added Warlords of Atlantis to the list. None of these films turned him into a box office giant, but they gave him a steady, distinct presence in a genre that decades later would earn a loyal cult following. Television work never slowed down either. Doug appeared in Barbary Coast alongside William Shatner, took part in the acclaimed miniseries Roots, and picked up guest spots across some of the biggest shows of the era, including Fantasy Island, Airwolf, Murder, She Wrote, and The Fall Guy. His last major regular television role came between 1987 and 1991, when he played Kyle Applegate, first the mayor and later the sheriff, on the fantasy sitcom Out of This World, introducing an entirely new, younger audience to Doug McClure without a single mention of Trampas. On paper, this looked like a comeback story about resilience, built almost entirely on his own willingness to keep showing up for smaller projects rather than waiting around for something as big as the Virginian to come along again. Off-camera, during roughly this same stretch, Doug was dealing with something considerably heavier than typecasting, a private struggle that colleagues would only really discuss once he was gone. The battle he fought while the cameras kept rolling. Several accounts from people who worked alongside Doug McClure during his 1970s adventure film years describe an actor who was quietly fighting alcohol even while delivering reliable professional performances on set. It's a detail that rarely made headlines while he was alive, in an era when actors were far more protected from that kind of story than they would be today. But it lines up with a pattern that kept surfacing throughout his adult life. Public steadiness paired with private struggle. A gap almost nobody watching from home had any real way of knowing about. That pattern extended well beyond drinking. In 1965, right as the Virginian was reaching the height of its popularity, Doug's father, Donald Reed McClure, died at age 61. The public was watching a rising television star at the peak of his career. Almost nobody was watching a son quietly grieving his father in the middle of that same success. Doug rarely spoke about it publicly, and it remained one of the heaviest private losses of his life. His marriages kept following a similar rhythm of public smiles and private restarts. He married Helen Crane in 1965, again at the height of the Virginian's fame, and that marriage ended by 1968, lasting only a few years despite Doug being, by every outward measure, one of the most successful men on American television at that exact moment. In 1970, he married Diane Soldani, and this one lasted longer, 9 years, and produced his second daughter, Valerie Diane. That stretch of the 1970s coincided with Doug searching for a new direction in his career after the Virginian ended, and for a while, family gave him a sense of stability his professional life couldn't. Even that relationship ended in divorce in 1979, making it his fourth marriage to collapse in under 2 decades. People who knew him consistently described someone who refused to let any of it turn him bitter, someone who kept opening back up to new relationships instead of shutting down, treating each failed marriage as a closed chapter rather than a permanent verdict on himself. That refusal to give up on connection was about to pay off, in the form of a marriage that would finally be the one that lasted. The wife who was there when nobody else stayed. Later, in 1979, while working in England, Doug McClure met Diane Fernberg. The two married that same year, and unlike every relationship before it, this marriage lasted the rest of his life, 16 years, all the way until his death in 1995. Diane was the one by his side as his fame settled into something quieter, and his health eventually began to decline, making her, by most accounts, the most important companion of his final years. Diagnosed with lung cancer in early 1994, Doug responded the same way he'd approached almost everything else in his career. He kept working. That same year, he reunited on screen with James Drury one more time for a Western reunion film, and took a small role in the big-screen version of Maverick, starring Mel Gibson and James Garner, a project that carried extra meaning since Doug had appeared in a minor role on the original Maverick television series decades earlier, right at the very start of his career. It was, in a strange way, a full-circle moment arriving just as his story was ending. He continued accepting new projects throughout treatment, telling colleagues he didn't want to be seen as a patient before he was seen as an actor. That determination paid off with one of the most meaningful moments of his professional life, when, on November 16, 1994, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a formal recognition of nearly 4 decades in the industry, arriving just as his body was beginning to fail him. Early in 1995, while filming in Hawaii, Doug collapsed on set. Colleagues initially feared a stroke or a serious heart problem, but tests back in Los Angeles revealed the cancer had spread to his liver and bones. He died on February 5, 1995, in Sherman Oaks, California, at 59 years old, just months short of his 60th birthday. He was buried at Woodlawn Memorial Cemetery in Santa Monica. His final film, Riders in the Storm, was completed while he was still fighting the illness and was only released to audiences after he had already passed away. There's one more detail that says a lot about how people actually felt about him. Years later, The Simpsons character Troy McClure was partly built as an affectionate nod to Doug. And according to his own daughter, Doug found the joke genuinely funny, with his kids sometimes calling him Troy behind his back just to make him laugh. His daughter Tani went on to build her own career as an actress and singer, while Valerie chose a quieter, more private path, and both kept their father's memory close for years afterward. So knowing everything he was quietly carrying behind that easy on-screen grin, what do you think finally made Doug McClure the kind of man his own children still wanted to tease? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this unveil, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.